after that. So welcome everybody. China today we have Robbie Warwick from the Australian Citizens Party. So
Yeah.
I would,
Mm.
let's welcome uh,
No, I see.
Robbie. And then Robbie, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself because before your presentation? Up, uh, up to you now, Robbie.
So far, but
Thank you, Albert. Yeah, I'm Robert Barwick from the Australian Citizens Party. I'm the research director of our political party. I've worked in this party for 30 years, or a little bit over 30 years now. I often call the Citizens Party um, the most successful political party no one's ever heard of, but we're trying to change that. Um, we've we've we don't get the media coverage that I believe we deserve, but we are very central to a lot of important political debates in Australia. Everyone in Parliament certainly knows who we are, because one of my jobs is I spend a lot of time in Canberra, in Parliament House, talking to members of Parliament on policy issues to try and build coalitions of support to get some good policies enacted. And probably outside of the China subject that I want to talk about today, probably the thing we're best known for at the moment is our party for a number of years has been campaigning against the banks closing branches and removing ATMs and taking away access to cash, and that is inconveniencing many people. The removal of face-to-face banking services has inconvenienced a lot of vulnerable um, bank customers, uh, and that's at least a quarter of the population, if not more. But the banks don't seem to care. What they've also done is expose vulnerable customers to these very sophisticated online scams now, which people are getting uh, caught up in left, right, and center. And if the face-to-face service was still there, plenty of the elderly, etc., would still be using the bank where they have certainty. So our party has a policy. We want the government to bring back a public bank like we had with the Commonwealth Bank, but run it through post offices so that a lot of countries in the world have a post office bank. We want Australia post offices to become the branches of a government Australia Post Bank here. So it doesn't matter what the private banks do. You can if you really value face-to-face services, and plenty of people do, they can move their custom to the post office bank, and it will always be very convenient for you. So I've spent a lot of time campaigning on that, and this is um, this collage on the wall beside me. That's from a campaign we ran a few years ago, where we were the party that got an inquiry into what happened to Christine Holgate, the CEO of Australia Post, when Scott Morrison so brutally removed her from her position. Um, Nobody else questioned it except our party, and we turned around public opinion and we got an inquiry into that. And the reason we did question it is because we knew that Christine Holgate supported a post office bank. She wanted a post office bank, but she made enemies of the private banks, who definitely did not want to have to compete with the government bank again in post offices. And we strongly believe that was something to do with what was done to her. But that helped to lead into the campaign, and we're we're kind of hoping that one or the other of the major parties might actually say something about a post office bank before the election. So I don't know if they will. Watch this space. We know there's discussion about it, but if they do, they're not going to credit the Citizens Party. But you've heard it from me. We deserve the credit.
Okay, so go back to our today's topic, please, Robbie.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity, Albert, to uh, address your group. Um, what I've decided to call this is Australia should be independent and be friends with China, uh, because this is another issue that the Citizens Party has become well known for, because we grew very alarmed at the all the talk about China and war in the same sentence. And we've been very vocal in opposing that, and I want to elaborate to you now our reasons why, and the reason we think Australia should think very differently on this subject than the mainstream seems to at the moment. Um, the most bizarre thing about any talk about conflict with China is our biggest and best trading partner by a mile. In fact, no country in the world would benefit as much from trade with China as Australia does. It's quite extraordinary. I have to confess, I didn't get time to look up the very latest figures, but the last time I looked, we had something like a $120 billion trade surplus in our favor, whereas we have something like a $30 billion trade deficit with the United States. So the United States gets all the profit from trade with Australia, whereas we get the profit from trade with China. And that's no small thing. And that's all at risk and has been at risk for the last few years because of all the rhetoric. Now, the way that trade has developed has been mostly very positive, but I will admit that there's been some negative aspects to it that I don't think have anything to do with China, namely, and I'm just taking a wild guess here, but the average age of this audience, you probably have had enough experience and a memory, a historical memory of when the Australian economy was very different to how it is now, such as when we had more manufacturing. And we were we were a manufacturing powerhouse for a long time, and we've lost a lot of that. Where I live, I'm in Coburg talking to you, uh, and my part of the world near my house, etc., is Glenroy Broadmeadows, and I now drive past this paddock, and it's an empty paddock, and it used to be the Ford factory. So what used to be a center of manufacturing and manufacturing skills and manufacturing training is now just an empty paddock, and it's very, very sad. And the reason we lost it is because people 30 years ago decided to outsource to China, and they were trying to outsource to chase cheap labor, whatever the reasons for the corporations were. It came at the expense of Australia's manufacturing. Um, but China didn't steal it from us. This was government policy in Australia encouraging that. And I reject the narrative that some politicians get into, as if China somehow stole this from us. However, in the larger picture, despite that unfortunate loss of our manufacturing, in terms of the way our economy works, like I said, we profit enormously from our relationship with China. Now, another concern that gets expressed is that it's not good for a country to be so dependent on one other economy as we are on China. People fear we put all our eggs in one basket, and I'm sure you can understand that fear. And I think there's a principle there that you can acknowledge that it probably isn't good in principle to be really, really dependent on one country. However, I will say this: Australia is very lucky that China is the country that we're dependent on. Because what China does with its economic policy is so successful that the demand that has grown year after year with its economic growth has benefited Australia, because we get to supply them the raw materials to feed that demand. Whereas if we were this dependent on a country like the United States, for instance, which some people want us to be, we would have been in real trouble long before now, because it is not economically successful at all. Europe is nowhere near as successful as China. So yes, although it's good to diversify, we are lucky that the country that we have this economic dependence on is China, and I'm firmly convinced about that. So Australia, in many ways, is the lucky country. Now, let's talk about China a little bit because it's interesting to see how China has organized itself to be so successful. You know, you probably, I would assume most people are familiar with just the facts that China is the economic miracle of our time, and not just our time, probably in world history. What it has achieved in the space of a generation to lift almost 1 billion people out of poverty has been stunning. Um, and the way China did it is through a fairly humble approach of being prepared to learn from other countries. And so the reality is China and Chinese leaders like Deng Xiaoping went around the world looking at what worked and what they could apply in China because they were prepared to acknowledge by the 70s that some of the things that they had done didn't work.
Hello?
Hello? I'll keep talking. Um, and so they did. Now, one of the things that our party would argue is the things that they did that were successful are the things that we used to do in Australia, are the things that America used to do in America that were successful for us. And those things mainly revolved around being prepared to make long-term investments in infrastructure, especially, and industry and public investments. And that's how Australia built itself. And I'm quite an expert in the history of the Commonwealth Bank and how it was a development bank for our country and the way it invested in the infrastructure that drove up our living standard as a country, and we're still benefiting from now. This the private sector, doesn't do the big nation building things that governments do. And we had governments that were prepared to make these investments, and they had economic tools like the Commonwealth Bank that they could use for such investments. And we built the infrastructure. We built fantastic infrastructure. We built the Snowy Mountain Scheme, for instance. Um, and on the back of that, our living standard as a country absolutely surged. So that was successful for us. It was definitely successful for the United States. In fact, that system of having a public investment in infrastructure and fostering industries to improve your economy back in the early 19th century used to be called the American system because it was a contrast to what was known, the economists called the British system, which was just free trade and everybody opening up their markets to the British East India Company. The Americans said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to have our own industries. We're going to invest in our industries. We're going to protect them with tariffs, and we're going to invest in infrastructure. And we copied that. And so this was very successful for us. This is how we built our economies. And the Chinese said, well, let's do that as well. And they've done it in an absolutely spectacular way. And a lot of the success of the Chinese economy is comes down to these very large development banks, industry banks that it has, some of the biggest banks in the world, to do this kind of investment. They've transformed themselves. They've raised 1 billion people out of poverty. They've increased their demand as a country, such that they are the holy grail of markets. Everyone wants to break into the Chinese market. They always did, by the way. I remember reading this history book a couple of years ago where the historian referred to the fact that back in the 17th century, British textile merchants used to fantasize what they could do if they could convince the Chinese to change their fashion to add an extra 6 inches of material to the hem of their garments. And because if they just add an extra 6 inches of material to the average garment hem, then the extra textiles they would need that would be so enormous that the British textile manufacturers would have a big market boom providing it for them, right? Um, and then I had a friend of mine who passed away in 2009, Professor Lance Endersby, who's from Monash University, engineering professor. He had these great project ideas for Australia, including for a Melbourne to Darwin fast freight line. And when he promoted it, because he talked about we could get fast freight to Darwin in 24 hours and then use high-speed shipping to get it to all the biggest ports in the world within a few days, including China. He had this great little example he used of if everyone in China just started having one ice cream extra a year, then the dairy industry in Victoria would have would have an absolute boom just providing the dairy products for the extra ice cream consumption. The Chinese market's always been eyed off that way until what they call the century of humiliation, of course, where the economy absolutely collapsed. So that by the 1949 revolution, China was 1% of global GDP. Before the British arrived, it had been about 20-25%. After a century of the British, it was 1%. That's how poor China was. And of course, now what it's actually achieved is get back to that position that, in a sense, it used to occupy. So they've done that. But they're not just doing that, they're now taking that approach that's worked for them and they're sharing it with the world. And it's called the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's working. And the proof it's working is that 20 years ago, even less, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, um, China's number one market was the United States. I think the one company, Walmart, was like the third or fourth biggest importer from China, just one company, the American retail company. Um, uh, Now, China's biggest market is not the United States. It's not Europe. It's what they call the global south, or what we used to call the third world, the developing countries. They are importing enormous amounts of goods from China because they can afford to, because they've been working with China and China's been helping them build infrastructure, raise their living standards, with their consumption has gone up, and they've become this extra market for Chinese goods as well. And so that's physical proof that this method's actually worked. Um, and Australia should be looking at that and saying, well, why wouldn't we want to be part of that? And initially we did. When the Belt and Road Initiative was first proposed under the Liberal government of this country, they were very, very enthusiastic. We attended the initial conferences for the Belt and Road Initiative. Um, Dan Andrews here in Victoria went off on his own and even signed a special deal for the state of Victoria with the Belt and Road Initiative, a special memorandum of understanding. But even the federal government was very enthusiastic. Scott Morrison signed a Belt and Road Initiative deal with China that you probably remember when this was controversial with Dan Andrews a few years ago, and the federal government cracked down on Victoria for this because by then the tone had changed. Scott,
Sorry, it seems
okay, Albert, I've just unmuted myself.
sorry.
No, you're right. You're right. Um, yeah, our politicians were very enthusiastic about what working with the Belt and Road Initiative meant for Australia, all the extra economic opportunities that came with it. And this is why I've called this Australia should be independent and be friends with China, because this is the best example of how we're not independent. Because then Donald Trump got elected in late 2016. Now, the political turn in America against China had already started under Barack Obama, but it was being done in a sort of a wonkish way where policy types were talking about it, but it wasn't part of the popular discourse very much. But when Donald Trump got elected and he appointed people like Mike Pompeo to his government, who was first the CIA director and then the Secretary of State, John Bolton was another one. These people came to power with an agenda to pick a fight with China, to treat China as an adversary. And a simple explanation of what they wanted was this. They saw that China was overtaking America in economic terms. And there's a political doctrine that the United States politicians espouse. It's known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which says we, the United States, will never tolerate a rival economic or military power. And on the basis, because they espoused that doctrine about 1992 after your generation lived through the Cold War. So, in the Cold War, the world was bipolar between the Soviet Union and the American side. Um, uh, when the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed. There was only one superpower left, the United States, and they said, we're never going to have another rival superpower. The problem was, while America did a couple of stupid things, including deregulating Wall Street, and so their economy went from being one based on the world's leading manufacturing economy to one of money changing, and in a crazy way that led to the global financial crisis in 2008 and blew up all the banks. So they did that to their economy. And then they also embarked on just war after war after war, which was very expensive, very destructive for the world. And China didn't do that. And China got on with improving its economy. And when it dawned on these Americans that China had overtaken them by some measures, they couldn't stand the idea. And so they decided, no, okay, we're now going to pivot our economic and strategic thinking to containing and stopping China's rise, not beating China, stopping it. There's a difference. They could try and outcompete China, and that would be good for the world, probably. Who can come up with the best products? Who can come up with the best systems? But they don't want to do that. They want to block China. And then they expected Australia to go along with that. And all these Australian politicians, including Liberal politicians who had been very enthusiastic, suddenly flipped because Uncle Sam said so. And this is why I maintain, and the Citizen Parties maintain, and a lot of people that we have worked with maintain, that it proves Australia is not an independent country. Now, I'll just mention one of the people that we got to work with, who I'm sure you all remember. The author of this book, I'll just hold it up there. In 2014, the former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser wrote this book, Dangerous Allies. And he was talking about the United States and the United Kingdom. And the point he made in that book is Australia has actually never been an independent country. And by the time he wrote that, he was someone who he thought that it was good that we won the Cold War, but we needed to, once the Cold War was over and the world didn't have to be at loggerheads, we should all be collaborating together on things that can benefit the whole world, including economic development, etc. And instead, he saw the United States lead countries like Australia into war after war after war. We know the Iraq case. I know a lot about the details of these wars. Most people probably don't know quite as much of the details, but we all know the Iraq war was based on a lie. A lot of these wars are based on lies. And Malcolm Fraser, he was so outraged at not that America was doing this, but Australia was following it along in an unquestioning way, that he wrote that book and said, look, we've never been independent. We need to become independent. And I had the pleasure of working with him for the last few years of his life, while he was trying to get this message out before he unfortunately died somewhat unexpectedly. But when he gave me a copy of this book, he said he had a little blurb he'd been working on, a little promo blurb, which was that it went, Australia needs the US alliance for our security, but Australia only needs security because we're in an alliance with the United States. That's actually what he said. Because if we actually just got on and dealt with other countries independently, we would find that a lot of the things we're afraid of, or we're told we should be afraid of, are not quite what people think. And that was his view, and I must say I agree with it. Now, a little bit about our party. When this turn in politics in Australia came, and we found first the Liberals, but then also the Labor Party went along with this rhetoric, we were very originally disappointed and then alarmed. Now, I can remember in 2015, we had a conference here in Melbourne, It was an international conference with international guests. And the weekend we held the conference was the weekend that Tony Abbott was still Prime Minister. He announced that Australia had joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And this was a Chinese initiative at the time, which was before the Belt and Road Initiative. Very important institution, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and Australia joined it. And when the news broke, we informed our conference and everyone cheered because we were just excited about what this meant economically, that we were going down this path of realizing the investment in infrastructure is the most important thing to improve our economies, post-global financial crisis and all those sort of things. And what was striking about Tony Abbott doing that was that Barack Obama had asked Australia not to join it. Because that's like I said, even before Donald Trump, the Americans had started taking this turn. And so when Tony Abbott joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, it was an independent decision. It was the last independent decision I think the Australian government ever took to actually be at odds with the United States on this question of China. Tony Abbott's embarrassed by that today when he shouldn't have been. He's embarrassed that he showed some independence back in 2015 because he's jumped on the anti-China bandwagon. So at first it was disappointing, and then it became increasingly shocking because the media started pumping out this torrent of claims about China that anything China did was headlines, and we would look at these claims and say, well, where's the evidence of anything that you're claiming? And we were quite experienced with how these kind of campaigns could work to condition people to accept a certain view. And it was clearly coordinated. And we got to know who the key players in the media were that were pumping out all this. And then 2020 came and we had the COVID pandemic. And in our view, it got very dangerous because that's when it went to actually a discussion about war. The talk turned to war. China's this evil country. Look, it's produced this virus. Everything coming out of China is bad. Any collaboration we had with China was being held up in the media and demonized. There was the Australian newspaper one day had a front page where they had all these photos of Chinese academics and a few white academics who did collaboration with China in Australian universities, and it was like a hit list designed to intimidate those people and shame them publicly for having any collaboration with China at all. And I found this very alarming. And I remember I called up. I wanted to talk to some of these academics, and I called one at the University of Tasmania, the white guy, because I instinctively knew the poor Chinese guy on the list would have been terribly intimidated by being singled out in the media like this. And the white guy I spoke to just happened to be of Russian heritage, and he said to me, "Look, this reminds me of what Stalin did in the 1930s. What was in the Australian newspaper today?" And his colleague had been too, as I suspected, his colleague had been too intimidated to even come to work that day because of being singled out like this. And it got very disturbing. Asian people and Chinese people were being singled out in the streets, were being abused verbally, sometimes physically, in the streets in Australia because of this tone. And for us, the worst part was the talk about war, because the the day war breaks out, everyone will regret it. That's the nature of war, right? As my personal view, and I'm one of the leaders of our party, and our party's view, we will do everything in our power to campaign against wars starting. It's far better to stop a war before it starts than to stop a war after it starts, because it can be very, very difficult to do that. And of course, the human toll is absolutely terrible. And we just couldn't believe it because we're talking about our number one trading partner. That didn't change all through this period. China was still our number one. In fact, our trade with China went up during this period because we're so dependent on China. But the talk was of war, and it reached the high water mark on Anzac Day 2022, when Peter Dutton said Australia must prepare for war. And we just thought that is completely alarming. And in 2020, for a long time, it was as if our party stood alone in being prepared to take this on. Now, we have a weekly YouTube show called The Citizens Report that you can see on YouTube. And we often talk about this subject, but especially in 2020, we were pushing back hard against people normalizing the talk of war when it came to any country, but especially China, because um, that's a recipe for a world war, which will be a disaster for the world. And all because people in America with their collaborators in Australia do not want to accept the reality that there's no longer a what's called a unipolar world. There's no longer a sole superpower anymore. Um, all China did was get on with growing, and now the world has to acknowledge that it's there as another superpower, and there's nothing America can do about it unless they blow the world up. And I think as a country that's an ally of America, and there's a good reasons we're allies of America, instead of going along with them on this, we should be talking bluntly with them and being frank with them so that we can strengthen the people inside America who don't want to go to war either. Um, but we were quite alone in that for a long time in this country. And I must say, some of you may remember March 2023 when Paul Keating appeared at the National Press Club and made headlines all over Australia, all over the world. He came out as a senior statesman, someone who, with experience in international diplomacy and leader to leader discussions, etc., uh, and just totally denounced how crazy this was. And now there's much more of a tempered discussion. There's the rhetoric has toned down. Even Peter Dutton has toned his rhetoric down. I'll give credit to Anthony Albanese that the rhetoric has changed, and that is to be welcomed. That's quite important. Um, and even though there's still this faction in the media that attacks him every time he says something positive about China, and they attack him, oh, he's putting money first. He's putting our trade first. Well, I hate to break it to the world, but that's what countries do. That's in our interests, our trade. It's got nothing to do with America. That's in our independent national interests. And our Prime Minister is right to factor that in when he's dealing with China, and not going along with what the most extremist voices in the United States might be saying. That said, the rhetoric has changed. The policies haven't, because the legacy of this rhetoric, this war rhetoric, is we've been saddled with the biggest boondoggle in history, the $368 billion AUKUS nuclear submarine program. And we will be paying for that whether we get them or not. If I don't know, I won't go into too much detail, but that's true. There's no guarantee we're going to get them, but we're going to be paying for them anyway. We already have started paying for them just so that we can have a technology that was not to defend Australia, and that it is absolutely not to defend Australia. It's to help Australia be equipped to work to fight alongside America if there's a war against China. And these submarines will be used up there in the North Pacific and South China Sea, not here. Um, and that's what we've been saddled with, and we're paying for it. And this is as insane as economic policy and defense policy actually gets, in our view. And we've gone along with that. Albanese went along with that, and now we're saddled with it. And it's part of a much bigger military build-up in this country that we now have a Marines base in Darwin. We have more permanent American military installations in this country than we ever had during the Cold War. In fact, during the Cold War, when hard men like Malcolm Fraser were the Prime Minister of this country, they would never, ever, ever have accepted the Americans putting Marines in Darwin, ever. But the outlook of Australia's politicians today is very different. They're very subservient to the United States, and they just roll over and accept these things. And so that's the reality in practice. And it just underscores we're not an independent country. And our party has a policy. Our landmark policy is, as I said earlier, a postal bank, but second one, an independent foreign policy. We must become an independent country. That doesn't mean becoming an enemy of the United States. We are friends with the United States. We have a history with the United States, but a true friend talks frankly and doesn't subjugate their own interests to the interests of their friend. And we don't have that choice now because we're not independent. And the more we militarize and allow American military facilities here, the less independence we have. And that's so far hasn't hurt our trade relationship because well, sorry, that's not quite true. It has hurt our trade relationship. We went through that period with Scott Morrison because Scott Morrison, I see things very differently to the way the media presented that. Scott Morrison was so deliberately obnoxious in the way he decided to demand an inquiry into COVID on China that the Chinese finally said, well, enough's enough. And they took measures accordingly. Those restrictions have now been lifted. So the Chinese have made it clear that, if you want to trade with us, we want to be friends. And if you don't want to be friends, well, we're not going to cut you. We're not going to do you any favors. But I think on balance, Australia should be friends with China because we've benefited so immensely from that friendship. And therefore, we should be independent, and our party will be taking that to the next election campaign. So I'll end there and leave time for questions, Albert, if that was okay.
Oh, thank you, Robbie. So, anyone would like to ask Robbie any question, I suppose, especially on China and our independent foreign policy?
Ah, I
Yes,
do.
please. Yes, Dale?
I do have a question, but I don't know whether it's relevant. I've never understood the America leading the value of the dollar, and I don't know if Robbie can explain that.
Yes. So in 1944, very important conference in the United States, a place called Bretton Woods, designed the architecture for what became the post-war financial and trading system, and they they had to they settled on a system where currencies would fix themselves their value to the US dollar, and the US dollar would be fixed to gold and or pegged to gold, and just so that you could have a way of measuring seeing the relative values of these currencies, which in those days were fixed. The exchange rates were always fixed, and one of the I won't go through all the details how it worked, but one of the features of the financial system in those days is you could get 30-year fixed rate home loans um, in countries like Australia because there was actually a lot more stability in the financial system before they deregulated everything. And then a lot of speculators come in and they make money out of making currencies go haywire. The world in 1944 valued the idea of stability. And in fact, the 2 decades after World War II was in global terms, China excluded, was the biggest advance in productivity in human history because the stability allowed a lot of investment and global productivity just zoomed. Um, for the rest of the world, it's really dropped off, and all the productivity growth has been in China since then. Um, but the gold part was important, and the other part that was important was the US dollar. And the reason they picked the US dollar, Dal, is because in 1944, the US was clearly the world's economic superpower. It was the most productive country on earth by a mile, and it had the strength to back up its currency. Because if you're trading in a currency, you want to know that if you're accepting a currency for that good that you've just sold, that you'll be able to buy something with it. And America literally produced everything. And so if you accepted US dollars, you could get it from America. You could get whatever you wanted from America, or you could swap it for gold, right? That's how the system evolved. But then that ended in 1971. And the only thing that saved the US dollar as the reserve currency is Nixon did a deal with the Saudis, um, so that the Saudis said we will only accept payment for oil in US dollars. And that then gave the American dollar, because it was no longer pegged to gold and manufacturing was already on the decline, actually, that then gave the American dollar strength from being underpinned by oil, the world's oil trade, which of course is essential, and everyone will always need to, has always needed to use it. And that it was able to keep that reserve currency status by virtue of that. And it's just the easiest by having one currency that the whole world can have confidence in. It's just easier for trade. You can always trade in US dollars, right? So you can be in, Chile and Argentina doing a deal in the tip of South America, and they don't know whether they trust each other's currencies, but they'll both trust the US dollar. That worked really well until this latter period of America just going so gung ho into all these wars and all this extra global tension, and America starting to use the dollar as a weapon by sanctioning countries. And they would say, okay, we're cutting you out of the US dollar system, the SWIFT system. We're cutting this country out of the SWIFT system. And they've done it to Russia, and they've done it to people in China, and they've done it to other countries. And the problem that they've done is they've actually undermined the value. Like they've made countries start to become afraid of being dependent on American dollars because they've used it as a weapon. And now America's worst nightmare is materializing because many countries are saying, well, we're going to look for alternatives to the US dollar. Now, countries like China and Russia and the big ones, they don't want to pull the rug out from under the US dollar because they value global stability above all else. So they're not out to destroy the US dollar, but they are exploring alternatives to it so they're not completely dependent on it. And people in America are looking at this and going, well, hang on, we don't have any really economic strength to back up our currency anymore. All we have is just the reserve currency. We have the biggest debt in the world, and we only get to have this big debt because we have this reserve currency. And if countries move away from it, we're economically going to be in trouble. And so there's real alarm about that. But the only way they'll solve it, in my view, is to change their strategic and economic policies and diplomacy with the world, and stop making so many demands, stop thinking they can dictate to countries, and then they might shore up some confidence in their dollar again.
Thank you, Robbie. But would you believe my computer was unstable and I lost a lot of that? I had to come on the phone again. But thank you very much for doing.
You can always watch the video back on YouTube. I will be posting this video in about 5 o'clock this afternoon. So you should be able to get it.
Thank you, Albert.
Any other questions?
Richard.
Robbie, the post offices do have some banking facilities. How will your proposal go on top of those?
So at the moment, you can bank at the post office. We want you to be able to bank with the post office. So the post office is an agency for most of the private banks. And unfortunately, while it started off as a convenience that you can also access if your post office is closer to you than your bank branch, and you just want to get some cash out, go get it from the post office. The banks I'm not going to say anything nice about them. I can tell you, I'm pretty disgusted at the way they behave. The banks have decided, well, they could exploit that to close their branches even faster. Now, then they put restrictions on what you can do at the post office. So that they take away your face-to-face service, tell you to go to the post office, but then they put arbitrary restrictions on what you can do at the post office. So they have limits on what you can withdraw and what you can deposit. Now, that may not bother, most people, but it's a problem for small business, for instance, because sometimes if the limit is $7,000 that you can deposit, well, on any given day, a small business may have more than that to deposit. And then that's a real inconvenience. And it's only because the bank has put that limit on. The post office, I work with people who run post offices. They're 2/3 of post offices in Australia are small businesses. and their association supports our policy, they're happy to do full banking, but they're not allowed to, and so it's quite restricted, and it's small businesses who tend to suffer that way. So you wouldn't have those limits. Plus, we're talking about full banking services, um, plain vanilla in the sense because we wanted to be provided, inexpensively, but full banking services. So full deposits, full withdrawals, loans. You should be able to get loans from the post office bank. Bear in mind, it's the post office being an agency for a government bank again, like the Commonwealth Bank was. Um, and and when I say loans, at the moment, all the private banks in Australia, they don't care about lending to anything else except home loans. That's all they're interested in is home loans. Small businesses find it really hard to get loans from banks. We envisage that the post office bank, because it's the government bank, will be back in the business of lending to small business again. And a lot of small businesses in the areas, they need those smaller business loans, personal loans. Um, the post office could do plenty of personal loans. So we don't see it as competing much in the home loan market. It's probably not that necessary, but go to the post office bank to get a personal loan, for those things that different people need. Can I say, I met the oldest lobbyist in Australia a couple of years ago in Parliament House. His name's Everald Compton, and he's still there lobbying today. When I met him, he told me the first Prime Minister he ever lobbied was Robert Menzies, Sir Robert Menzies. Um, and he's a huge fan of this idea. He told me, and one of the things he pointed out in his experience, uh, elderly people and grandparents, they would love to be able to get personal loans because sometimes they want to help out the kids and grandkids with, school fees or whatever, and that can be a way to help them with their cash flow to do that. And the bank could be in the business of providing that kind of service. So that's what we envisage. It would be banking with the post office, not just banking with the private banks at the post office.
Would the post offices be capable of handling that sort of work?
Well, they assure us they are because they've actually one. I just had a meeting with a former Australia Post employee who was there when um, post bill pay began. You're probably all familiar with bill pay at the post office. Before bill pay, post offices handled small amounts of cash, but when bill pay started, and you could have this convenient place to pay your bills, the amount of cash they handled exploded. And they've been for 20 plus years now, they've been handling lots of cash. Like that's the number one logistic issue for any kind of branch or a post office. How do you handle the cash? They've got all the security systems. Um, they don't have those automatic screens that all the banks seem to install once upon a time, for security for the tellers. They got their own versions of that kind of security, but not quite as formidable. Except go to a bank branch today, and the banks don't have that anymore either. They've dismantled all that. In fact, you go to a bank branch now, you're often talking to a concierge, and they're asking you your business, what you want to do at the bank, right in front of everybody, and you've got very little privacy in most bank branches now. Um, so there's a lot of it they can do, and for some of it, such as applying for a home loan, we envisage that when the government sets this up, they would have back office functions. So regional headquarters where, proper bankers employed by Australia Post Bank would come to you and talk to you about your loan application or something like that. Maybe in your house, maybe at a regional headquarters, maybe at the local post office by appointment. So they'd be able to work that sort of thing out. It's just about having a commitment to providing the service. And once you've got the commitment, then you just solve the problems to make it happen. What we're dealing with the private banks at the moment is they don't have the commitment. They don't want to provide the service. They think they can get away with forcing us all to go digital. Every time a bank closes a branch, it saves them $1 million a year on average, $1 million. They have closed about 3,000 branches in the last 10 years. That's $3 billion they're saving. Australia Post says, well, you're sending all those extra customers to us. You should pay a little bit. And Australia Post can't get $15 million out of these banks. Australia Post has saved them billions, and these tight-fisted banks will not kick back in as much as 15 million to make sure that you can have some form of a banking service at the post office. So they've lost their social license to have a special role, a special say in this. The government needs to go back to having a government bank, and the post office provides a synergy. It can be done inexpensively.
Are you having any luck?
Oh yeah, no, that's why I said if you see, don't be surprised. I can't guarantee it, but don't be surprised if either Albanese or Dutton or both start
because
talking.
suddenly I've only got 6 kids, so yeah, I think it's probably.
If you fold the table.
I was just saying, don't be surprised if either Albanese or Dutton or both might say something about this before the election. Now, if I'm not guaranteeing they will, but I can tell you, I'm in the middle of some pretty interesting conversations about it. And we've worked very hard to take this idea from nothing to something that's starting to become very popular.
Yes, I have also experience with my bank. I was doing some home renovations, and the contractor want us to pay in cash. So it wasn't a lot of money. It's only $25,000. But I need to go to the bank 5 times, each time getting $5,000 and queuing up over an hour for that $5,000. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
But anyway, John has his hand up for a long time. John, please.
Robbie, there's a question in the chat.
Oh.
Does your party have any member in Parliament? I wonder if you could speak a bit about that.
Sure. Sorry, I wasn't following the chat. That's you, Ibrahim. No, we don't. I've had plenty of experience in Parliament House. We haven't got anyone in Parliament. However, I am the Senate candidate for Victoria for the upcoming election. So I'm the lead Senate candidate. We are running some very well-credentialed and high-powered Senate teams around the country, including New South Wales and Western Australia. In New South Wales, our candidate, Dr. Andy Schmulo, is a powerhouse of he's a real crusader against the kind of misconduct big financial institutions get into, and on behalf of the victims, the little people who often just get left by the roadside. And he's more than a match for any bank lawyer, our candidate in New South Wales. So anyway, hopefully you will see some coverage of the Citizens Party. I can't guarantee it because it's the most frustrating thing about being in our party. We do all this work, and we're flat out getting the media to acknowledge it, and that's why we haven't been in Parliament up until now. I mean, back in 2004 and 2007, we ran the second biggest slate of candidates of all the parties, but you wouldn't know it from the recognition that we get. However, we've just kept working and building our recognition. There's lots of different people and lots of different subjects who actually understand the important role we've played in policy debates around the country. So we're hoping that finally translates into something in electoral terms. Now, it'll be a long shot, a real miracle if we did get someone elected in this upcoming election. But my goal is to make, as one of our candidates' daughters said, make a dent, at least be noticed as a party. So I can stop making the joke we're the most successful party no one's ever heard of. At least be noticed as a party so that the public awareness can set us up for more success in the future.
One more question, can I?
Yes.
Back to your post office bank. What do you think would happen if that sort of bank starts, and then after a few years when they go bigger, won't they just revert to the same sort of ideas that the private banks have? Because what I'm getting at is that that's the nature of the bank, especially based on the fact that growth is the only measure of success for the banks and many of the other institutions as well?
Well, look, I there's no guarantee. I would really hope not. And the best thing I can point to is our own history and something very interesting in American history, actually. We had the Commonwealth Bank for 86 years. It started in 1912 and it was privatized it was finished being privatized in 1996. So 84 years we had the Commonwealth Bank. We've had no public bank for 29 years. And then aside from the Commonwealth Bank, we had all these state banks. Many of you probably remember the State Bank of Victoria. Now, I've had these fierce arguments with ideologues who hate the idea of the private banks having to compete with the government bank again. And they always say, "Oh, what about the State Bank of Victoria?" Well, the State Bank of Victoria was an incredibly successful institution for 150 years, and right at the end, silly governments put silly managers in there to turn it into a version of a merchant bank in the era of the 1980s when everyone wanted to be a corporate cowboy and the bank crashed and burned. So you do not judge you do not judge the worth of a state bank by what happened at the very end of its 150-year existence. It lasted 150 years because it was very good at what it did. It was very valuable, including there was a lot. We don't have public housing in Australia anymore, but we need to get it back in our view. And in the era of when governments did build public housing in Victoria, it wasn't the government using the state bank to build it. The state bank did the building. The State Bank of Victoria built the best houses in the state. It was a mark. People used to advertise when they sold their house, built by the State Bank of Victoria, because it was a mark of quality, and that it's that kind of investment that gave us our living standard. So you look at the history and go, well, why did we let that go? And we had state banks in other states as well, and we had a culture of public banks. And then ideologues came around and said, no, the government should have nothing to do with banking. It should be purely private exercise. So we've had a quarter of a century of that. And in our view, it's been a disaster. And so the only thing I can hope, because you can't actually write this stuff in legislation, well, you can write it to a degree, but unscrupulous ideologues will always find a way around it in the future. So what our Met Party tries to do is just really impress on people how much of a disaster it's been, get them to understand that a lot of this has to do is because we gave up these institutions that were so valuable, so that when we get them back, we don't give them up again. So we don't measure a state bank by how profitable it is. We measure it by how helpful it is. It'll make a profit because it's a bank. It'll cover its costs. But is it being helpful? Is it providing services that the economy needs? And that's how people need to measure a state bank. And in the United States, funnily enough, which is the most ideologically opposed to this kind of thing usually, and it's a real culture of private banking over there. There's one state that has a bank. It's called North Dakota. It's the Bank of North Dakota. And this thing was started in about 1919. And this state bank works with the state government there. North Dakota is the only state in America that hasn't had financial difficulties. It's the only state in America that didn't run into trouble after the global financial crisis in 2008. And all because its bank plays a really important role in supporting the local economy. And the fact that it's lasted as long as it has and played that role, which is different than the private banks, the people of North Dakota love it, they value it immensely, and they'll never let it be turned into the rest of the banks in America. And so we just want something like that here.
Yes, I can also put in another point here. Public services, when you privatize it, it becomes somebody's tools of earning money.
Yeah.
So many public infrastructure should always be held in the hand of the government because these public infrastructures actually support our standard of living. For example, we privatize the electricity. Looks, we now have the electricity bills. We have the wire connect to our. They come up with many different ways of trying to just screw us. That is the way of privatization.
Yep.
Okay, I see Roy's hand up. Roy, please unmute yourself.
Yes, last week the presenter, who is a very similar line to yourselves with regard to approach to China, he raised the issue concerning war with respect to a potential red flag. And he gave the Philippines as an example where the red flag may be raised. And I'm just wondering whether to counter a red flag, the idea is to have somebody publicizing it before it actually occurs, then it becomes ineffective. I was wondering if your Citizens Party were thinking about doing that at all.
Oh, we do it all the time and as much as possible. We have a weekly publication, which I work on, the Australian Alert Service, and uh, inevitably in any given week there's an article in there debunking and warning, either debunking some claim or warning about these red lines that are being approached, and so people can understand them. Um, and without going into all the specifics, but I can tell you now, Roy, examples of these include in the last couple of years, there's been headlines about how Australia's military has had confrontations with the Chinese military. Like our ships have been buzzed, for want of a better word, by Chinese Air Force, or our Air Force has had so not collisions or anything, but there's been a war of words between them, or we were told that chaff was released from a Chinese plane and got sucked into the engine of an Australian jet and all this kind of thing. There was one claim that the Chinese had shone a laser into the eyes of Australian pilots, and this was very dangerous. I can tell you now, if you almost none of what you've read about those incidents is true. Almost none of it. There's a formula in the media, and the media only take it from the people who are pumping this stuff out, where they're deliberately confecting alarmist stories. And the first thing I point out to people is, where did these incidents happen? And almost all of them, not quite all of them, almost all of them are not off the shores of Australia. They're off the shores of China. So in other words, we're in their area. They're not in our area. We're in their area. And there are times, and there was an incident in the LOC last year, which is an example of this, where we claimed we were there legally, but the UN authority under which we were there didn't exist anymore. And what we were actually there was, as usual, just going along with the United States. And so we call out, every time we find the evidence of this, we call it out quite loudly. My personal inspiration is Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln was a young congressman in America, there was a war with Mexico. And Abraham Lincoln gave a famous speech in the US Congress, and it's called "Show Me the Spot," because the US government had claimed that Mexico had shot some American soldiers on the US side. And Abraham Lincoln knew they were lying, that the fight had been US soldiers inside Mexico, and that the government just seized on this because to get the war that they wanted. So this practice is not new, by the way. Anyway, Abraham Lincoln famously said, "Show me the spot." It was very unpopular when he gave this speech, because wars can, at the beginning, too many wars are popular, especially in America. But he said, "Show me the spot." He wanted the evidence, the actual evidence. And so we sort of take that as our inspiration. We are going to shine as much light on these claims as we can, so that nobody gets away with pulling the wool over our eyes just to get a bad outcome that we'll all regret later.
Okay. Ken also has a question on the chat. Is there a way of retreating from the nuclear submarine deal?
Yep. Stop paying. The whole thing, as Paul Keating said at the press club in March 2023, he talked about how there was the press conference in, I think, San Diego, right, John? I think it's San Diego. There was Albanese, and there was the British Prime Minister, whichever one it was at the time, I can't remember now. Oh, Rishi Sunak, I think, and there was Joe Biden, and they're all praising AUKUS to the skies. But Paul Keating said, but only one person was paying, and that's our mug, the Prime Minister of Australia. So stop paying. This is crazy. Uh, and it's so unlikely to happen anyway, but we're going to keep paying. It's unlikely to happen in the way that they initially spelt it out. But we may end up with nuclear submarines. It's just they'll be American ones where we've accepted, like, America will provide our protection for us. And that means we have even less independence if that's the way it materializes. Um, but that's not actually that easy to just say stop paying. Partly because there's a lot of other dependencies we have on America. So I spoke earlier about our dependency on China because we do have this symbiotic relationship with trade, and we provide the raw materials for their manufacturing. But we have a real um, uh, unsatisfactory dependence on America financially. Our financial system is completely subservient to America's. Our banks have a lot of debt they owe the US capital markets, which sometimes those markets just call in overnight, and that's what happened in 2008 to Australia. The majority shareholding in our banks is by US investors. So the biggest foreign investor in Australia is the United States. And so the Americans can strangle us financially to make us do what they want if that's what they choose to do. And trust me, they're a ruthless country. They don't play nice in this area, and that's another reason we need a postal bank, because we've got to go back to having our own sovereign financial capacity where most Australians don't need to be dependent on institutions that are controlled by America. We need to have our own bank, and that'll give us some independence in the financial system. That'll give us more freedoms when it comes to making foreign policy decisions.
Okay, another question. What is the shifting role of strategic alliances then based on which principles?
Well, the the current strategic alliance that's defined the world is based on this unipolar principle, which is already out of date, but people in America are clinging to it. The Chinese, and they're the most eloquent at this, the Chinese are espousing a development model for world relationships. So it's less, it's so there's an implied strategic component to it, and sometimes there are strategic agreements. But it's underpinned by a shared commitment to economic development. And that's what the Americans didn't do when they had their unipolar moment. The Americans are too close to the British, and the British have only ever seen the world in one way, and that's as places that they could, the whole British Empire was based on the British setting up places that they could reap the rewards from economically, financially, etc. And in the post-war era of US dollar reserve dominance, the Wall Street institutions, the City of London financial institutions, they've taken full advantage of that to, I would say, loot the world in many ways and make sure all that loot flows into their coffers in London and Wall Street. And they've used the IMF and the World Bank to enforce their claims. And so the IMF and the World Bank, which were actually also institutions from the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 that were initially conceived of to help countries, they haven't been very helpful at all. They've been enforcers of these claims by London and Wall Street financial institutions. The Chinese have shown something different, and it's a development model. And they say, well, they use this term win-win. Everyone should be able to benefit from these kinds of investments. And I think they've shown the world that it works. Certainly, just by virtue of how many countries have signed up to work with China, most of the rest of the world is confident that it works. And with those economic relationships comes strategic agreements. And so the Chinese and other countries, they have they've uh, they've been able to get these important uh, pacts, for want of a better word, around the world, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which covers most of the countries of Eurasia, where they actually agree, where it's a treaty agreement with these countries to support each other's security. But those agreements are underpinned by the economic agreements that are primary, which is what everyone gets out of them.
Could I just quickly comment on that as well?
Well, you are the expert, John. So, and I'm not
I
being
think it's
funny there.
important.
John is. So, listen to what he has to say about it.
Just to a little gloss on what you said, Robbie. China has in its constitution a constitutional requirement to not enter into a military alliance with any country in the world. So the Chinese concept of a strategic partnership is, as you explained, fundamentally economic. And that's what they call them. A comprehensive strategic partnership is all about the economic cooperation between the two countries for mutual benefit. So there's no alignment. China is a non-aligned country. It was a leading country in the non-aligned movement when that movement was vigorous. And it may be, the non-aligned movement may very well be reinvigorating itself again. But I think it's really important to understand that China will not enter into military alliances with any other country, whereas Australia, with its military alliance with the United States, has been fundamentally coerced into entering into military alliances with Japan and with the Philippines, which, of course, increases the risk that Australia will be engaged in any war that breaks out in relation to China, which the United States is still trying to stimulate.
And John, bizarrely, we also have this partnership with NATO, which has nothing to do with our part of the world or our security whatsoever.
Yeah, yes, you're quite right. It's totally insane. And just quickly on the gentleman who talked about red flag, what I was talking about was what was called a false flag operation. And I was saying that we all need to be on the alert for a false flag operation, which is designed to create the impression that China and the Philippines are at war. Because of our now alliance with the Philippines, we would also be engaged and, of course, make ourselves a target. And I'm not saying that we should not go to war against China because China is 100% friendly to Australia. The main reason we should not go to war against China is that there is no possible prospect of ever winning in such a conflict. It is guaranteed destruction of Australia if we were to go to war against China. And all the American think tanks, of course, make the same point, that a direct war between China and the United States guarantees the destruction of the United States, which is why they are so anxious to avoid direct warfare with China and so keen to put Australia in the firing line to try to bog China down in a war in which the United States will not be actively participating.
I also remember Kissinger's claim that it is very dangerous to be an enemy of United States, but it is fatal to be United States allies.
Yeah.
Well, I would also like to share with everybody the Nature Index, which is out about 2 or 3 days ago. So let me just do the share screen first. Nature's Index, this one. Okay, this is from Nature. And the time frame is 1st of November 2023 to 31st October 2024. So it is the latest. So it is the institution tables, the top institutes having an impact on science. Okay, coming up, one is China. The second one is Harvard. Third, China. Fourth, China. Fifth, China. Sixth, China. Seven, Germany, Max Planck. And then China, China, China. Oh, the top 10
Yeah.
scientific institutes in the world. Oh, eight of them are Chinese. And you also look at the share of contribution. Chinese Academy of Science is 2,633 versus the second one, Harvard, which is less than half, 1,143, a little bit. China has risen up not only economically, but also in science and technology. And if we want to go into war with China, it will be our destruction, no doubt about that. Okay, so stop share and then come back to Robbie or anyone who would like to say something more.
Well,
We still have about
I do have a comment.
50 minutes. Yeah.
I do have a comment on what you just said then, Albert. When I was talking a bit earlier about 2020 and how extreme the rhetoric against China became, I did talk to a lot of university academics in Australia. One of them actually showed me the statistics that proved that Australia, in scientific research terms and university research terms, punched well and truly above its weight. We ranked very highly, more than most countries, but the reason why is not because the Australian government funded research. In fact, the Australian government neglects the funding of research compared to what it should, but because our universities were very good at collaborating with these Chinese universities. We had all these collaborations going with Chinese universities where the Chinese side tended to provide the funding, but Australia's universities benefited from those relationships. And then 2020 came along, and it was like Joe McCarthy, the US Senator from the 1950s, had been unleashed, and any contact with China became suspect. And for these universities, all these security measures were put in place to scrutinize the slightest bit of contact between Australian universities and Chinese universities. All academic freedom came to an end. All the things that they could do that were just a matter of course. Not only did they have to get the government the special permissions, they even had to get ASIO permission to have this kind of contact. Australia just lost its mind. It went down a real reds under the bed mentality, absolute paranoia to our detriment, because none of this was true. The FBI in those years ran a program called the China Project at the FBI because they were determined to root out all these Chinese spies in academia who were using the cover of academia in America to spy on America. And they arrested a bunch of Chinese spies, supposedly, but when these cases went to court, they're all thrown out because they're all based on political paranoia. There was no evidence for any of it. And eventually the FBI shut down the program because they got severely embarrassed by it. And it's one of those manias. It's like the Salem witch hunts of that the Crucible, the story of the Crucible is about. So yeah, we damaged ourselves immensely by that attitude because we used to rank much higher than we do, but we damaged our cooperation.
Question?
Yes, please.
Recently, even President Trump announced that his main goal is to contain China. Well, given that technologically China is now seems to be superior to United States, and some of the evidence are this DeepSeek and also Alibaba AIs, which supersede everything else in the world.
Yeah.
What I can see is that the only way they can contain China, especially with the buildup of all these arms, I heard about 80 different bases around China has been established, and they're doing more. So the only way is to have a war with China. There's no other way I can see if they want to really continue with this approach. Could you please and
I I fear that one of the weaknesses of uh, President Trump, one of them, uh, is he's operating on wrong information on quite a few fronts, actually, including some of the details he talks about with the Ukraine war. His information is clearly wrong, and so he can only go by what he surrounds himself with, and if he thinks that America can contain China, that's the language he uses, then he's not up to date with where China's at. Now, maybe the silver lining there is his relationship with Elon Musk, because one person in the world who does appreciate what a powerhouse China is Elon Musk, whatever else you might think about him. He is his biggest factory is in China. He understands how immensely productive China is, and how in that on that front it's left America in the dust. The thing I fear, because I know many Americans and I have my whole life, is there's too many Americans who are stuck in this 1950s view, not of the world, but of themselves, where they think that America is world beating at everything and always will be. And that if they don't look at them,
Oh, sorry, always click on the wrong.
that's all right.
Sorry,
Can you hear
I'm
me?
always. Yeah.
I just said that they have this 1950s view of themselves where they are world beating at everything and always will be. Now, there was a time when America was the gold standard of almost everything, clearly. And if you were brought up in that era as Donald Trump was, that would give you a certain outlook. You know, we're America. We can do whatever. No one can beat us at anything. Well, it's not true anymore. And what does America have that leads the world? They've got Facebook, Twitter. They got all this online stuff, and even then they're not world leading at that, because that's why they want to ban TikTok and they want to ban DeepSeek. But that's not where an economy starts. That's the icing on the top. An economy starts at your ability to manufacture, provide goods, etc. And they are way behind. They used to be the best at that. They're way behind on those things. But if people don't understand how an economy really works, they can talk themselves into a conflict that then they can't actually back up. And that would be a scenario where I think people who you would otherwise assume, if because they're head of the Pentagon or strategic thinkers in America, would not talk themselves into a fight they can't win. If they don't recognize how weak they actually are as a country, they may talk themselves into a fight they can't win.
Can I just not necessarily dispute with you on that, but qualify it? In my opinion, right at this moment, the American military is very much stronger than the Chinese military. And it will take another
I agree.
5 to 10 years before China is in a position to say to the America, like in the nuclear pacts of with Russia, that if you attack us, it's self-destruct and what's the word? I forget
Yeah.
now.
Mutually assured destruction.
Mutual, and that won't take place. That's why I believe America wants to get this red flag going, because they probably got 5 to 10 years where they can achieve that, because China will have very limited capability right at this moment of military action on American soil. In 5 or 10 years, they will have the capability, and that's when mutual destruction takes place.
Well, Roy,
The world economy will be destroyed,
sure.
but military, it's a different question.
No, but Roy, I agree with you completely. When I was saying fight, I meant this kind of Trump thinking that he can use economic means to contain China because they can't cash that in. And so if their goal is containing China and they actually can't do it through any other way, then people will say, well, the only ace we have over China is our military. Because you're right, they do have the military superiority at the moment. Now, even then, they couldn't beat China in a war on Chinese soil. There's no way in a million years. They couldn't even beat Afghanistan on Afghanistan soil. There's no way they're going to beat the Chinese on Chinese soil. And I see nothing in China's history that will ever, in a million years, be interested in invading America or invading Australia. The Chinese have never thought that way. That's not how they operate. But it's what Americans can talk themselves into. And so, yeah, if they're going to be so committed to this one policy of containing China and nothing else works, then there are some lunatics on that side of the Pacific who will say, well, then we've got to go to war. And we know who they are. I'm already
Hi, Noel. How are you?
Oh, well,
debunking
thanks.
them.
Well,
Now, on this point, I have a little bit different view. China will be able to defend itself, but China will not be able to attack the United States. But China will have no problem defending itself against Americans' attack on China's soil.
Yep. I agree.
Any more questions on anyone? Robbie, it has been a very, very interesting talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the invite, Albert. Thanks for everyone's attention. This has been quite enjoyable. Look out for the Citizens Party at the election and any announcements about a post office bank.
I would like to get the two major parties some kind of dent because they think they are the only governments. We need to tell them that no, you are not, unless you do a proper job.
Well, did you look the headline from the by-elections on Saturday is striking. Neither party in Werribee got 30%. Together, neither party reached together the two major parties didn't reach 60%. First time ever. And in Paran, they didn't reach 60% either, but Labor Party didn't run then. The public is growing increasingly sick of the two-party model. I personally believe that it's good to have a bigger crossbench in Parliament because it makes the two parties have to deal with the crossbenches to get their laws up, and it makes them more transparent, and that's always better for the system, extra transparency. But having dealt with all of them, I wish, I've got, I have good relationships with as many people as I can. I look for common ground to work on. So you don't agree, we're a different party. We don't agree on everything by any means, and some things we strongly disagree on. But I'm happy to work with people that we might have disagreement on if we got common ground on certain issues. But I really think Parliament would benefit from having Citizens Party people in there, not just on the outside talking to those inside, in there and helping to make the decisions.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. And next week, we will have Jerry Gray.
Oh,
and
great.
then, of course, John and Robbie. The link is still valid. So you're welcome to join at the same time next week. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Albert. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See you guys next week.